World War II in 1943 brought countless tales of courage and cunning, but few as strange and brilliant as that of a humble grocer whose spoiled milk became a weapon of war. In a small European village caught between advancing German forces and retreating Allied troops, a local grocer watched as 28 German tanks rumbled toward his home along the muddy country roads. The year was cold and unforgiving. The war had already carved deep scars across Europe, burned towns, broken families, and empty shelves where food once stood in abundance. The grocer, a man named Emil Hartmann, had lived all his life in that quiet valley, running a modest store passed down from his father. Every morning, Emil opened his shop not for profit, but out of habit and duty. He sold what little he could find: dried grains, old cheese, and vegetables from nearby farms. His milk, once delivered fresh by local dairymen, had turned sour over the weeks. Bottles of spoiled milk filled the back of his cellar, useless and foul-smelling. Yet Emil couldn't bring himself to throw them away. Waste had become a sin in wartime. On that grim morning, the sky hung heavy with low clouds, and the air carried the scent of rain-soaked soil. The distant rumble of engines began as a faint tremor beneath Emil's feet, growing louder with each passing minute. He stepped outside, his apron still tied around his waist, and squinted toward the horizon. The sound was unmistakable: German armor. He could already see the faint glint of metal through the mist, the silhouettes of massive tanks crawling down the valley road. Fear spread through the village like wildfire. Mothers rushed to gather their children, men hurried to hide whatever valuables they could, and the elderly prayed in whispers. The Allies had retreated days ago, leaving the village defenseless. The German advance was swift and relentless, crushing everything in its path. There would be no soldiers to protect them, no barricades to stop the iron beasts rolling toward their homes. Emil stood frozen for a moment, his mind torn between fear and disbelief. His heart pounded as he thought of his wife and their 2 young daughters, hiding inside the shop's small storeroom. "They'll come through here," he muttered to himself. Right through the main road. He could already imagine the tanks grinding through the village square, their treads tearing up cobblestones, their guns swiveling toward the fragile homes that had stood for generations. He turned his eyes toward the muddy road that wound through the valley, his road. The winter rains had softened the ground, turning it into a treacherous mix of dirt and puddles. Every wheel that passed through sank deep, leaving behind ruts as wide as a man's arm. Emil knew the land well. He had walked it daily to collect produce from nearby farms. He knew every curve, every patch of soft earth. And as he looked upon that mud-slicked stretch, an idea, wild, desperate, but strangely possible, began to form in his mind. Still, he was only a grocer. What could he possibly do against tanks? The thought seemed absurd. Yet desperation has a way of breeding ingenuity. Inside his cellar sat hundreds of gallons of spoiled milk, a useless burden he had been meaning to dispose of. The smell alone was unbearable, sour, thick, and pungent. He glanced back at his store, then at the approaching tanks. Somewhere deep inside, the spark of survival ignited. Before that spark could turn into action, a neighbor rushed to his door. It was old Marta, the baker's widow. "Emil, they're coming! You must hide!" she cried, her hands trembling. Emil nodded absently, but his mind was elsewhere. He wasn't thinking of hiding. He was thinking of slowing them down, buying the village time. The Germans wouldn't stop until they had passed through the valley, but if the road could somehow hold them back. The tanks were closer now, their engines roaring like thunder. The ground shook with every movement. Birds scattered from the trees. Children screamed. Emil's wife, Clara, called out to him from inside, but he barely heard her. He was already moving toward the cellar. The wooden door creaked as he pulled it open, the stench of spoiled milk washing over him. Each bottle represented a small failure of wartime living, milk that could have fed families, now wasted by the cold and the lack of electricity. But perhaps, he thought, that waste could serve another purpose. "If it's slippery enough," he whispered, testing a drop on the cellar floor. It spread thick and oily, mixing with the dirt into a slick paste. His eyes widened slightly. It might just work. Above him, thunder rolled, but it wasn't the sky. It was the tanks. They were on the hill now, visible to everyone. Their iron forms gleamed even in the dim light, monstrous and unstoppable. The villagers ran for cover, slamming doors and dousing lamps. Emil stood in the open, breathing hard, his hands trembling. He had never felt so powerless, or so determined. He turned back toward the road and took one last look at his village. The cobblestone street, the old fountain, the crooked wooden sign of his grocery. All of it might soon be gone. But maybe, just maybe, his small act could make a difference. He didn't know how or why, only that he had to try. And so, as the German armored column approached, the humble grocer from the valley prepared to defend his home. Not with guns, not with soldiers, but with the strangest weapon imaginable: milk gone bad. As Emil Hartmann moved toward the cellar where he kept his wasted stock, the air grew heavier with the rumble of the approaching German tanks. The sound was not just noise, it was the echo of doom. The very ground trembled beneath his boots. He knew he had only minutes before the armored convoy reached the first bend that led straight into the heart of the village. Every second mattered. He swung open the cellar door and descended into the darkness. The scent that greeted him was almost unbearable. The spoiled milk had been festering for weeks in old wooden barrels and tin containers, its surface curdled into a pale, thick crust. The air was sour and heavy, enough to make his eyes water. But this was all he had. "You'll do," he muttered, his voice hoarse with determination. He grabbed the first container, a metal churn used by the dairymen before the war, and dragged it up the steps, spilling some of the rancid liquid on the floor as he went. It splashed across his boots and filled the air with a stench that made him gag. Still, he didn't stop. The tanks were coming, closer and louder. He could almost feel the vibrations in his chest now. Emil rolled the churn to the edge of the dirt road. Rain had been falling since morning, turning the ground into a sticky, uneven mess. The tracks left by farm carts were now deep furrows filled with muddy water. The grocer knew this road better than any soldier. It was the only path through the valley. If the Germans were coming, they had no choice but to take it. He looked at the churn, then at the road, and without hesitation tipped it over. The spoiled milk flowed thickly, mixing with the brown mud, creating a grayish film that glistened under the dull afternoon light. The smell was overwhelming, but Emil paid it no mind. He ran back for another container, then another. Each time his movements grew more frantic, more desperate. He slipped, fell once, caught himself, and kept going. As he worked, Clara appeared at the door, her face pale and frightened. "Emil, what are you doing?" she cried. He didn't stop. "I'm doing what I can," he answered, his voice low but steady. "If they can't move, they can't reach us." "But it's milk," she said in disbelief. "You'll only make a mess." He gave her a tired, grim smile. "Sometimes, a mess is exactly what we need." She hesitated for a moment, then, without another word, turned and disappeared back inside. A moment later, she returned with their eldest daughter, a girl of 12, holding a small wooden bucket. "Here," Clara said, breathless. "We'll help you." Emil's throat tightened. He wanted to tell them to go back, to stay safe, but there wasn't time. Together, they formed a silent rhythm. He poured from the heavy barrels, while his wife and daughter spread the milk farther down the road with buckets, sloshing it into every dip and hollow. The mud churned beneath their feet, slippery and cold. The smell clung to their clothes, their skin, everything. Far down the valley, a faint light flickered, the reflection of sunlight on metal. The tanks were now visible, crawling like dark beasts over the distant ridge. The sound of their engines filled the air. Emil felt the ground quiver again. He looked over his shoulder and whispered a short prayer, his hands trembling from exhaustion. The last of the barrels were nearly empty. He tipped one more, watching the final streams of thick, white liquid ooze into the earth. The mixture was foul and slick, coating the muddy road like a mirror of decay. The grocer stepped back, wiping his brow with a muddy sleeve, and surveyed his work. The path was a nightmare of slush and milk, impossible for a horse, let alone a heavy tank, to cross without trouble. A few villagers peeked from behind their windows, whispering in disbelief. They couldn't understand what he was doing. This man who had fed them, who now stood in the middle of the road, covered in mud and sour milk, defying tanks with nothing but the contents of his cellar. Some thought he had gone mad. Others watched in awe. The rain began again, soft at first, then heavier. It turned the milk into a frothy mess, spreading it farther down the slope. Emil smiled faintly. The weather, for once, was on his side. He watched as small rivulets carried the milky sludge toward the lower part of the valley, creating patches of slick mud that glimmered faintly under the grey clouds. Behind him, the tanks drew closer, massive, unstoppable. Their engines roared like beasts awakened. He could hear the shouts of soldiers, the grinding of gears. Emil's heart raced, but he didn't run. He stood at the bend of the road, his boots half sunken in the muck he had made, watching history come toward him. At that moment, he wasn't just a grocer. He was a defender, an inventor, a man who refused to surrender his home to steel and fire. The odds were impossible, but courage rarely cares for odds. He turned once more to Clara and their daughter. "Go back inside," he said quietly. "Stay with the others. Whatever happens, don't come out." Clara hesitated, tears glistening in her eyes. "Emil." He looked at her one last time, forcing a smile. "If this works, we'll have time. That's all we need. Time." The tanks were at the edge of the valley now, their treads cutting deep into the soaked ground. Emil could hear the rumble echoing through the hills. He stepped aside, hiding behind the low stone wall near the bend, his heart pounding like a drum. The spoiled milk had done its part. Now the war would test it. The first tank, a Panzer IV, approached the bend cautiously, its treads grinding deep into the wet road. The driver could see nothing but fog and drizzle ahead. The German column was advancing under strict orders to reach the next Allied line before nightfall, but the rain had made every mile a battle. The tank commander peered through the slit of his hatch, trying to spot movement in the valley. Everything seemed still, too still. Then, with a sudden metallic groan, the tank's right tread slipped. The massive machine lurched sideways, wheels spinning uselessly in the pale grey muck. "Verdammt!" the driver shouted as the entire vehicle shuddered. The commander barked an order, and the driver tried to correct the turn, but the more the treads spun, the deeper they sank. What should have been solid ground had turned into a slithering trap. Behind the lead tank, the others kept advancing, unaware of the danger ahead. The second and third panzers followed, their treads churning the milky sludge into a thick, greasy soup. Within moments, the road became a nightmare of slipping iron. One tank's front end skidded sideways, colliding with another. The sound of grinding metal and snapping treads echoed through the valley like thunder. From behind the low stone wall, Emil Hartmann watched in disbelief. He could barely breathe as he saw the first tank tilt, its treads spinning wildly before it sank halfway into the mud. The next one tried to pull around it, but the slick surface offered no grip. Its weight, nearly 30 tons, worked against it. The machine slid sideways, colliding with the first in a deafening crash. The milk and mud frothed beneath the treads, bubbling like a cauldron of filth. The villagers, hidden behind shutters and cellars, could hear the chaos outside. Metal clanged, engines roared, and soldiers shouted in German, commands turning quickly into panic. "Vorwärts! Zieh ihn raus!" someone yelled, trying to direct a tow. But it was no use. The ground beneath them had become a trap of their own making. The more they struggled, the worse it became. Emil's heart pounded. His plan, his desperate, insane idea, was working. He clutched the edge of the wall, his fingers cold and trembling. Each tank that tried to move only deepened its fate. The once sturdy road was now a battlefield of immovable giants. The fourth and fifth tanks tried to reverse, but the slick mixture extended far beyond the bend. As they attempted to back up, Their treads spun helplessly, spraying the foul mud in all directions. The rancid smell of sour milk filled the valley, mixing with diesel fumes and the wet scent of earth. Soldiers jumped from their hatches, slipping and falling face first into the mire as they tried to assess the situation. From his hiding place, Emil could see their confusion, the disbelief in their eyes as they stared at the road that refused to hold them. They shouted orders, cursed the rain, and struggled to attach tow cables between the immobilized machines. But even the cables couldn't help. The tanks that still had power were stuck just as badly as those that didn't. Every pull only dug them deeper. Every turn of the engine only churned the mud into a deeper pit. The once disciplined German column had turned into chaos. Engines overheated, exhaust plumes rose like smoke signals in the gray sky, and the ground trembled under the futile power of trapped machines. The valley echoed with frustration, metallic roars, human shouts, and the endless wet slap of boots against sludge. At the far end of the village, a small group of farmers and children peeked from behind a barn. They could hardly believe their eyes. The mighty tanks, the same ones that had leveled towns and driven Allied forces into retreat, were now helpless, sinking slowly into the earth like beasts caught in quicksand. Emil remained still, barely daring to move. He felt a strange mix of awe and terror. He hadn't meant to destroy them, only to delay them. But what he was witnessing was something beyond his imagination. Some of the tanks tilted so far that their treads lifted off the ground on one side, and the heavy turrets swung uncontrollably with the shift in balance. The sound of screeching metal tore through the valley as one toppled into a roadside ditch, its massive frame half buried in the mud. The soldiers tried to radio for assistance, but the thick fog and distance made communication difficult. Within minutes, the valley became a graveyard of steel, just as if the earth itself had turned against them. Emil could see one of the commanders pacing furiously outside his tank, waving his arms, barking orders. But his boots slipped repeatedly in the milky muck, each step worse than the last. Finally he fell forward, cursing and clawing at the ground to stand again. The irony was not lost on Emil. A farmer's road, a grocer's spoiled milk, and a bit of rain had done what no weapon could. 28 tanks brought to their knees, not by artillery, but by nature and a man's quick mind. Then slowly, the engines began to die out. One by one, the roars of machinery faded into the soft hiss of falling rain. The valley grew quiet again, except for the occasional groan of shifting metal as the tanks settled deeper into the mud. Smoke drifted lazily upward from exhaust pipes, blending into the mist. The German soldiers, soaked and defeated, began setting up temporary camps beside their immobilized vehicles. They were stranded, unable to move forward or back. From his hiding place, Emil felt an ache of relief and disbelief. His body trembled, not from cold, but from the overwhelming realization that his absurd plan had worked. He leaned against the wall and let out a long, shaky breath. His village was safe, at least for now. The road that had once carried the sounds of commerce and laughter was now silent, transformed into a graveyard of metal and mud. The milk that had soured in his cellar had become a strange symbol of resistance. In that moment, Emil Hartmann understood that victory doesn't always roar. It sometimes curdles quietly beneath the feet of giants. For nearly 3 full days, the German armored column sat stranded in the valley, their tanks half buried in the clinging mixture of mud and spoiled milk. What had seemed like a minor obstacle at first turned into an engineering nightmare. Mechanics worked tirelessly, soldiers shoveled endlessly, but the ground refused to yield. Every attempt to pull the tanks free only worsened the situation. The milk, now fermented under the cold sun, had seeped deep into the mud, transforming it into a gluey morass that swallowed wheels and boots alike. From the ridge above the valley, Emil Hartmann and a few of the braver villagers watched cautiously. The Germans were trapped, furious, humiliated, and exhausted. But Emil knew better than to celebrate too soon. The enemy was dangerous even when cornered. He urged the villagers to stay hidden, to let time do the fighting for them. "They will leave when they realize they can't move," he told them quietly. "Until then, we stay ghosts." The days crawled by. Rain continued to fall, washing more of the milky residue down the slopes. The once green valley now reeked of rot and fuel. Crows gathered overhead, circling the stranded machines as if sensing the death of momentum itself. The soldiers below built fires and tents beside their tanks, waiting for recovery crews that would never come in time. By the fourth night, a low rumble echoed in the distance, not from German reinforcements, but from the east. It was the unmistakable sound of Allied armor moving in formation. The British 7th Armored Division, having regrouped and resupplied, was advancing through the countryside once again. The delay caused by Emil's trap had given them the window they needed. The Allied command, unaware of the exact reason behind the German halt, marveled at their luck. Intelligence reports described the enemy as immobilized due to terrain conditions, but no one could have guessed that the terrain's betrayal had been brewed from spoiled milk. When the Allied scouts reached the outskirts of the village, they found the aftermath of an almost surreal battle. The valley road was littered with tanks, twisted, sunken, and rust-streaked. The soldiers moved cautiously at first, expecting an ambush, but soon realized the truth. The enemy was gone, their machines abandoned. The Germans had finally retreated on foot, leaving behind what they could not save. Emil watched from a distance as the Allied convoy rolled in. A jeep stopped near his shop, and a young British lieutenant stepped out, staring in disbelief at the sunken wrecks. "What in God's name happened here?" he muttered, half to himself. When the villagers began to emerge from hiding, timidly at first, he turned to them for answers. It was old Marta, the baker's widow, who finally spoke. She pointed toward Emil, her wrinkled hand trembling. "Him," she said simply. "The grocer." The lieutenant approached Emil, curiosity written all over his face. "You did this?" he asked, gesturing toward the valley. Emil, still in his mud-stained clothes, nodded slowly. "Not on purpose," he said with a faint, tired smile. "Just trying to make the road a little slippery." The officer laughed in disbelief, shaking his head. "Slippery? You've turned a tank route into a swamp. You've done more damage with milk than we could have done with artillery." News of the strange victory spread quickly among the Allied ranks. Within days, military correspondents and field photographers arrived to document what they called the milk trap of the Valley Road. They photographed the stranded tanks, the milky pits, and the humble grocer standing in front of his small shop. One photo, Emil leaning against a wooden milk churn, the faintest smile on his face, made its way into Allied newspapers weeks later, under the headline, "The Grocer Who Stopped Hitler's Tanks." Back in the village, life slowly returned to something like peace. The soldiers helped the villagers repair damaged roofs and clear the wreckage. Children who had once trembled at the sound of engines now climbed over the ruined tanks, laughing. Emil's small store reopened, though for a time, no one could stand the smell of milk. The villagers joked that he would never sell dairy again. One evening, as the sun set behind the hills, Emil sat outside his shop with Clara and their daughters. The valley was quiet now, the road still scarred but drying under the soft light. A gentle breeze carried the scent of wet grass instead of diesel. Clara looked at him, her eyes full of both love and disbelief. "You really did it," she said softly. Emil shook his head. "No," he replied. "The road did it. The rain did it. I only helped a little." But everyone in the village knew better. They had witnessed how a man with nothing but spoiled milk and courage had stopped the unstoppable. His quick thinking had not only saved their homes, but had turned the tide of an advance that could have crushed their region entirely. Months later, after the war pushed further east, a letter arrived at Emil's shop. It was sealed with the insignia of the British command. Inside was a brief note of thanks, signed by a major in the Allied forces. Alongside it was a small medal, engraved simply with the words, "For bravery and ingenuity in the face of the enemy." He never displayed it publicly. Instead, he kept it in a wooden box behind the counter, beside a single glass bottle of milk that he never opened. It served as a reminder, not of war, but of what ordinary people could do when forced to stand between destruction and survival. Years later, long after peace had returned and tanks were only memories rusting in distant fields, travelers passing through the village would still hear the tale. They would see the old road and the faint impressions where the tanks had once sunk, and someone, usually an old farmer or a child of the war generation, would tell them the story of Emil Hartmann, the grocer who stopped an army. They would end it the same way every time, with a smile and a shake of the head. Aye, it was the milk that saved us, the spoiled milk that turned monsters into statues. And so, his spoiled milk trap became an unlikely legend of wartime ingenuity, a victory born not of guns, but of wit.